Hey everyone, before we get into this episode of the Shock Absorber, we just wanted to let you know that this episode contains discussions related to sensitive topics such as sexual assault and also things around sexuality. If you are listening or watching the Shock Absorber with a young person, please use your own discretion. If any of these issues discussed raise concerns for you, please reach out to Lifeline on 131114 or a support service near you.
I think it's really important that we keep Jesus at the centre of our conversations, and rather than politicising our theology, we should actually be asking, what does the Bible teach us about these issues? And then how do we actually discuss that together in the church to have conversations around it?
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Third Space studio here at Soul Revival Kirrawee, and we are back here again with the Shock Absorber, episode 2 of season 4, and I'm joined by my usual co-hosts, Stu and Tim. How are you guys?
Hello, Joel.
Feeling good?
Yes, feeling very
good.
Enjoying
being in a different space. We're not in front of the combi van anymore.
Yes, it's good to have the combi back.
I can still see it in the church though.
Yes, but we'll be driving that out today if it starts. I'm not sure if it does yet. I'll have to let everyone know next week.
That'll be good. So
it's been sitting here for a while.
If it doesn't start, does it have to stay here for the rest of time?
Maybe.
Of course, that's dangerous. How do you feel about that, Tim?
Look, I think it makes a great feature piece in the church.
Or we
so
could strip
I
it
think
down
it'd be
for
great.
parts. That could be the other thing that we do.
It's prime seating right now, so when church comes back face to face.
Basically in front of where the band would play music, and also where we would be doing sermons when we return to normal gatherings. So we might need to move it.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, we'll tow it out at least. So guys, in this season, episode 2 of season 4, and in this season we've been talking about how we're ministering in the world that we live in, especially looking at the world around the 2010s and 2020s. And we're going to use musical artists as a way of analysing what's going on through the culture and those guys that have defined that era. But we've also mentioned that we're talking about Ian Hussey, who is a sociologist who analyses Australian culture and identifies basically that we live in a consumeristic society, but and how as Christians we should embrace and critique those different things. So the artist that we have chosen today, which is a little bit funny because her name is Taylor Swift, a very popular artist, but we should also issue a disclaimer that none of us actually listen to Taylor Swift. Is that correct, Stu?
I have heard some of the songs, and I do appreciate some of the songs, but I wouldn't call myself a fan. So we're not speaking with a great deal of authority today, but we are
on her music anyway.
Yeah, on her music. Yeah, but we are wanting to just recognise that she is one of the influential artists in the 2010s that have influenced our culture and also reflect to us aspects of our culture. So I think she's a really great artist to talk about today.
Yes, I'm actually looking forward to it. As we've started this season, it's the same with David Bowie. Was like, I don't listen to much David Bowie, but now I've looked into it a lot more. I'm like, this makes a lot more sense now why we chose David Bowie. And I think Taylor Swift is the same, Tim. Now, we were going to talk about the couple of three main things that we think that Taylor embodies in her music and also how she interacts with culture. So there's the myth of egalitarianism, the place of consumerism and wealth in our society, and anti-institutionalism. And then we're going to look at what the church's response is to that, and how does the Shock Absorber work out the aspects of the culture that we should engage and embrace or critique, and especially listening to the voices of young people at that time as well, and who can inform us better about those different things. So one of the things that we always like to do in the Shock Absorber is to pick a cultural artefact. Now that because we've chosen Taylor Swift as the musical artist, we're going to look at culture through. We chose a Taylor Swift song, which is Look What We Made Me Do, which I believe is from her 6th album called Reputation. And that was a number 1 single in the UK, Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, and the US. So quite a popular song, Tim. Do you want to break it down for us?
I don't know if I'll do justice to Taylor by breaking down the actual song, but it does illustrate some of the interesting things we want to talk about culturally, about this moment, this 2010s moment, and how Taylor has helped influence this, how she's spoken to us, and it was also a reflection of culture. One of the interesting things about this album is that was another marked change from her earlier album, 1989, which was quite poppy and light. That itself was a big change from her country career. So she's been going through these changes, and we talked last week about how David Bowie had these big movements over decades. Taylor's kind of reduced that right down. She's doing different changes over different times, which relate and also express different parts of her life. And so a number of things that the themes that we could sort of weave through this song and the way that and the culture that is coming out of it. So we've got that egalitarian idea that she's in this song and a number of others on the album. She's responding to her critics and the fact that she's has been victimised and online and had a lot of critique.
A lot of scrutiny.
Put against her, which happens to public figures, right? They're in the public eye, they get criticised. So she's trying to break that down a little bit, and so she talks about that. There's actually biblical motifs. This idea of coming back from the dead, rising back up, and so that she had a lot of particular moments that had happened to her in the public eye and different things in the news cycle that she was a part of. And so the song is coming out and saying, here I am trying to respond to these ideas. I'm trying to put myself back on it and have her own identity. So there's that individualism as well, but also I'm in control of my narrative. So trying to recapture who she is during this kind of season. It's a lot darker than her old album or the previous album. And so that kind of reflects where she was at as well, and the media that surrounded her. And so there's some of the things that are coming through in this particular moment. She talks about not trusting people. It's always interesting with Taylor's storytelling, from what I can gather, that she is sort of putting on personas as well, as telling stories from different points of view and different points of reference, which makes it easy. But she almost puts on a caricature of herself in a number of these places, and so is noticing if I was everything you said that I would be, this is kind of what it might look like.
Which is how the video clip of that song actually ends, I think. There's a whole lot of versions of different critics, but she's different versions of herself at the same time. So they're criticising her as the different versions of herself.
That's right, yeah. So she's a really great businesswoman. She really understands pop culture. She understands the pop music industry. And as we'll talk about throughout the podcast, she's had different ways in which she's related to that. Both, I suppose, using Hussey's category, she's embraced it and critiqued it at the same time. So she's really excellent in that space. And she's really great in terms of making music videos that are complex and have really deep themes. And her song writing and storytelling is a really big part of who she is and who she is in the public sphere and in the pop culture.
What she's experiencing. And
what she's experiencing, bringing her own experiences in there, which again is part of that egalitarian motif, is that she puts herself out there as an equal, and she identifies and also allows people to identify with her, that when we might have these moments of critique, when people pull us apart, have a go at us in different spaces, that we can identify with her because she's experiencing this and she's putting it out there for consumption and for our ability to engage with her in that way.
That particular song, it's a fascinating insight into what she is, how the kind of person she is as an artist as well. Because if you think back to her background, she started as a country artist. And I was listening to quite an interesting podcast by, it's actually a sports and pop culture website called The Ringer, and they were saying that one of the reasons that she moved into the country space was because she wanted to be a songwriter. She wanted to be the person who carried a guitar around and just wrote all her songs. But that was within an era where the grunge era was ending. There was that kind of garage rock revival in the early 2000s, and it was almost like music was either computer made or preppy and cute, like Britney Spears and NSYNC. But then there was garage rock, and she didn't really fit into those either of those categories. So then quite a few artists apparently moved into country because they could still be that songwriter person that they wanted to be. But it's fascinating that how so many, she takes so many different things. She's not the same level as Bowie at the moment, I would say, in terms of longevity, But it's interesting that she's doing the same thing. You talk about Tim. She took over some different personas already, and she's playing them out in a different way through the music business. So she understands how to put that out through the music business. Just what last week we talked about David Bowie was the same thing. And also I think she's very relatable. You talked about that as well. But then also how she almost hacks culture. So it's almost leveraging the idea of the internet and social media now. I remember you said before we recorded, Tim, that she was very prominent on MySpace. One of the things. Yeah,
so that was something I picked up while doing a little bit of research during the week, was that she was a very early adopter I don't know if she was early adopter in MySpace's history. In her history as an artist, she jumped onto MySpace quite quickly.
Which Justin Bieber was the same, actually. That's where he was discovered, on MySpace.
Yes, and I think what's that has done, and she's tried to keep this up through her career, is that it has put her in direct contact with her fans. And so this, again, is part of that egalitarian nature that she is putting forward, is that she's really relatable and that she talks with her fans directly. And so MySpace was an early social media platform in which she was able to do that. And she's been able to take that onto different platforms. And what this has done in terms of her cultural presence is that her fans feel very close to her, particularly the young women who are a large part of her audience, really do identify strongly with her, and she will respond to them. She will answer their tweets or talk back to them. She'll hang out with them at shows. You told me earlier, Joel, that there's been a couple of times when someone's tweeted her and said, "Oh, would you like to sing at my wedding?" And unannounced, she's just kind of turned up at a wedding and done a song. Yeah.
Which really knows how to leverage, like everyone's going to have their mobile phones out showing, look, Taylor Swift is singing. Like the way that she understands how to leverage that is really interesting.
Yeah, which is great. And I think, so in a similar way to David Bowie last week, she's both responding really well to the culture around her, but because she's right on the cusp, she is also creating culture. And I think that was something really interesting about David Bowie, that he was doing both of those things, trying to respond and trying to create new art that reflected his current cultural moment, but he was also creating the cultural moment by being right there on the forefront of change.
I think that's really true. And it's almost like, as we said, she's Bowie of a modern age, because if she's, like we talked about youth culture changing every 5 years, Stu, last week, that seems to be what's happening in a sense of what she's doing. Like, she very much identified with the hipster aesthetic and there's no greater promoting tool than Tumblr and Instagram of the hipster aesthetic, and she really got into that and saw another jump in her popularity because she managed to she didn't really grab onto the coattails, but she was riding that wave of cultural change where it's like, oh, now we need to put out as individuals, we're now putting out our persona on Instagram. It's not just our musical artists, it's every single individual has the opportunity to put out a particular persona that we can consume. That's a couple of things that Ian Hussey picks up on, is individualism, consumerism, egalitarianism. Can you speak to us of how Hussey's kind of dealing with those things and how we can relate that back to what Taylor's doing?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think for those of you who are not familiar with some of these bigger words and these big terms like egalitarianism, I could give just like a really brief little overview of what egalitarianism is to highlight how Taylor Swift is able to embrace this ethos quite well. Ian Hussey has reflected on Australian culture particularly, but he uses a tool that can be used on any culture, and we can see that using Ian Hussey's tool for analysing culture, we can see why Taylor Swift is so popular in Australia as well, because he's been trying to work out certain themes that Australians abide. He doesn't want to paint everybody with the same brush and stereotype people, but he also is looking for categories to help us to understand our culture. And it's helpful for us as Christians, because what Hussey says is that as we look at our culture, we can remember that the biblical writers will embrace and critique culture. So then we can look at different aspects of Australian culture and ask the question, what do the Bible writers say about that particular part of culture? And in Australia, there's this myth, we call it a myth of egalitarianism. And to understand egalitarianism is to understand the way many Australians see power structures, but not only in Australia, as we've been saying, Taylor is an American, so there's this egalitarian idea spreading across Western cultures. So what is egalitarianism? It's basically the opposite of a hierarchical power structure. So hierarchical power structures are defined as vertical power relationships,
top down
top-down relationships. Egalitarian power relationships are described as horizontal or everybody being equal. So many Australians would have heard of the tall poppy syndrome, for example.
Yes.
Tall poppy syndrome is a very egalitarian idea. The idea is that everyone should be the same. Some political scientists and sociologists have tried to understand this egalitarian ethos in Australia for many decades, and some of them have pointed back to our convict heritage, that it might have been that in the convict era there was a distrust of institutions. There was this idea that nobody should be better than anybody else. Whether that's right or not, I'm not sure. But there's this egalitarianism is called a myth in Australia, because even though we have this view that everyone should be even, our culture is not like that. There are people who are more successful than others. There are rich and poor. But just to break down the idea a bit more, just to give us a really clear idea of it, hierarchical structures have these characteristics. Basically, there's a belief that power should be distributed hierarchically, and in other words, someone's in charge and everybody has to follow that leadership. There's a belief in ascribed or inherited power, with ultimate authority residing in institutions. So in hierarchical power structures, power institutions is where people take their authority. There's an emphasis on organising vertically. So you know where you are in the pecking order in a hierarchical system. There's a preference for autocratic or centralised decision making. So, big companies or organisations, or dare I say denominations, have head offices and institutions that make authoritative decisions that then is spread out to the rest. There's an emphasis on who is in charge. People are wanting to know who's in charge in a hierarchical system. And there's a respect for authority and a reluctance to question authority in a hierarchical system. So it's good to understand that, to understand egalitarianism, because egalitarianism is pretty much the opposite of each of those things. So to break that down briefly, egalitarianism is a belief that power should be distributed relatively equally, belief in shared or elected power with ultimate authority residing in the people, emphasis on organising horizontally, preference for participatory or decentralised decision making, which again, you guys were talking about social media. That's a terrific example of egalitarianism, where there's this decentralised decision making. An emphasis on who is best qualified rather than who is just inherited power. And there's a suspicion of authority and a willingness to question authority, which is where we're going to come to with Taylor, as she's going to question authority of big companies like Apple. She's going to be questioning the authority of men, which puts her at the forefront of the feminist movement in the 2010s. And she's also an advocate for LGBTI plus community issues as well. So that willingness to question the established authority structures. And so what Ian Hussey says is important for Christians to understand as we engage with egalitarianism today is that a couple of things to remember is that, as we said earlier, that the Bible critiques and embraces certain aspects of our culture. And with regard to that horizontal relationships, the equality, speaking up for the powerless, we've got to remember that Jesus was very radical in his ideas and he transformed his world, that he treated women, children, the sick, Gentiles, people who were demonized by the power structures of the day. He treated them with great deal of difference. He raised them up rather than suppress them. And where Christianity spread in the early days of the Christian church, there wasn't a distinction between rich and poor, slave or free. There was an equality in the body of Christ that was really unusual in the Roman world. And so, we can look back and critique that these days with the lens of our culture, but Jesus did actually bring a great deal of equality to relationships, and that was very significantly different to the Roman Empire of the time, and even the Jewish religious authorities, who Jesus quite often critiqued and questioned, called the Pharisees snakes, for example. So there's you can just hear Taylor talking about the misuse of power in her songs, and you can remember that Jesus talked about the misuse of power from the religious authorities, for example. But the other thing that's interesting is that while God might affirm some aspects of our egalitarian culture, in other words, treating everybody as made in the image of God, that we're all precious in the sight of God, there's also elements of the Bible that what would God's attitude to the tall poppy syndrome be, for example? Like that might be something we could talk about later. Or what would the Bible writers say about Australians' overall rejection of legitimate authority? Because there's also writings in Romans, for example, where Paul says we need to respect the authority. So it might be really interesting if we can engage with that later. But in the context of Taylor Swift, I think it's fascinating to see this egalitarianism coming through, this anti-authoritarianism. And yes, she's a really successful businesswoman, but she's also got these political categories that are really interesting to look into as well.
That's the fascinating thing about the couple of things that the different court cases you had in terms of the musical industry. I think.
Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple. So the first one was when Apple Music was first launched, when they changed it from iTunes to Apple Music, they said that the first 3 months for every Apple user was free, and so none of the artists were receiving royalties. So she stood up and said, "I don't want this to happen. I don't want my music to be on during the trial." There was that one, but I think
and she was like standing up for other artists in doing that, wasn't it?
Yeah,
it's like
correct.
She could probably afford that, but other artists couldn't. So she was speaking up for them.
Absolutely,
like that's egalitarian.
Yeah, there was that one, and then there was also the one where she, Scooter Braun bought the publishing rights to her back catalogue, I believe, or it was a company. What was the company called, Tim? I can't remember what it was actually called, but it was called. Hang on, I will find it in a second. Big Machine. That's where she was doing her original albums. That's where she actually had an original 13-year deal with Big Machine, and then she only owned the songwriting credits to it, but she didn't own the publishing credits. So Scooter Braun, who is responsible for blowing up the careers of Usher and Justin Bieber, just to name a couple, he bought that. But then what happened after that was that she has now started re-recording her own songs so that she can own that back catalogue herself. But she also signed a new deal with Universal Music Group and a sub-company of that, where she wrote it was a clause in her contract, wasn't it, Tim, that she said, I can, if the Universal shares in Spotify are sold, not just me benefits from it, all the artists benefit from what's coming out of that sale. Is that correct, Tim? Is that what?
Yeah, that's my understanding, and people might be able to correct us in the comments. But yeah, and I think what it shows again is this anti-establishment. So she's able to say, these big companies who are in control of distribution and the way that money is handled, this sort of the musical industrial complex that it controls artists. And there's been commentary for decades about the way that the music industry is great for the companies and bad for the artists, and there's plenty of examples of that. And so part of her standing up, it's an egalitarian thing, it's an anti-institutional thing, and saying, no, that's not right. These are my works, and she did own the writing credits, as you said, copyright, but not owning the masters meant that she wasn't able to use those however she wanted, and every time they were used, she wasn't the one getting the most benefit from that. And so both this deal with Universal, in which shares of Spotify, that the money gets distributed more evenly, so she's able to empower others in there and give lesser known artists a bigger slice of the pie than they would otherwise get. And also the way that where she wants to be in control of her own creative outputs and not be dependent on the institution in order to distribute those things, but she gets to control those sorts of things as well. So that's an important part of that whole narrative that she's doing. And again, it's an expression of this cultural moment that expresses that anti-institutional, much more egalitarian in the way that she's reflecting culture.
I think that's interesting, Tim, because two of the categories that Hussey uses is wealth and anti-institutional. And the anti-institutional barometer in Australia is quite high. Australians are fairly anti-institutional. And again, there's a lot of theories about why that is. But sometimes the church is seen as one of those institutions that is not trusted. We talked about this last season when we talked about the growing distrust with young people with the institutions of the church, particularly after the Royal Commission into sexual abuse cases within the church. That was a major moment. there's also this idea that Australians generally don't trust government. For example, Hussey makes the point that in 2016, Australians' trust in government had dropped 8 points to 37% from a previous rating of 45%. So, 37% of Australians trust the government. It's really quite a low number. And you see that across other things too, like even NGOs, like non-government organisations, are a bit higher, but still people don't even trust non-government organisations at 52%. Trust in the media has also dropped. There's 32% of people trust the media. And so there's figures like this that are showing us that when Taylor comes up to talk about her distrust in the music industry or with Apple, then people probably are nodding, going, yeah, that resonates with me. So it probably makes her even more appealing to modern people because she's tapping into that anti-institutional trust issue.
Absolutely. And when you partner that with the way that she presents herself on social media as being very relatable, engaged with her fans, really approachable, you've got that double connection there that I, as someone who doesn't trust institutions, feel very close to this, yes, celebrity, but she doesn't trust institutions either. And so there's a solidarity that is created there in that cultural moment. All the while, her being, as you mentioned earlier, quite successful. Like she could afford not to get royalties from iTunes, and yet she stands up for those who are less. And so there's a sense there where she's using what power, influence, money that she has in order to try and empower others as well.
I think that's interesting too, because at one level you could think the tall poppy syndrome is no one should be richer than anybody else, and here's this woman who was quite rich standing up to power. But as a woman, I think she's seen as very brave, which is very accurate. She's been very brave in that. And also I think it's interesting how as a wealthy person, people admire the fact that she's been able to achieve that wealth. And that's why I said earlier that the egalitarian idea within Australia is sometimes described as a myth, because there's this other cultural category in Australia, which is wealth and consumerism, which is also highly regarded. So when you get an interface between egalitarianism and wealth, someone who is standing up for others and is wealthy is not seen as contradictory in Australian society, but it's seen as quite laudable. So that's really interesting.
And then maybe a counterpoint to that is just in the last few months, we've had this kind of billionaires race to space. And one of the big critiques out of that is you've got people like Jeff Bezos, who runs Amazon, who has been criticised in the last 12 months for underpaying staff in his factories.
That's true. Yeah.
And then yet pours billions of dollars so that he can get a space flight and be one of the first billionaires into space for no other reason that, it's a mark against his name of how great he is and how wealthy he is that he's able to put this money forward. And so they're the kind of stories where people put forward and say, yeah, we can't trust people with money. There's these institutions. Amazon is just dominating, particularly in the North American context, less so in Australia, but it's increasing here. And so they're the examples where we look to and go, yeah, see, power and wealth is corrupting. People are holding it for themselves and not passing it on. And which is why I think people like Taylor Swift are a great counterpoint, because still a lot of wealth. I don't know what she's worth, but I'm sure it's, she's in the very top earners, but she's using that to try and bring others with her
and create cultural change, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Absolutely.
But so it's almost like if you are wealthy and you're egalitarian, that's acceptable. But if you're wealthy and you're not egalitarian, that's not acceptable.
Absolutely.
So Bezos has just been criticised by Tom Hanks last week that he invited Tom Hanks to go to space for $28 million. So if Tom was willing to pay Jeff $28 million, he could go to space, and Tom laughed at that. And so apparently that was a public embarrassment for the Amazon crew. But yeah, I think it's interesting that Tom Hanks made that connection, that if he joins that elite group, he probably could afford $28 million to go to space, but if he joined that wouldn't be very egalitarian. So Taylor is really onto something. And I think what's interesting for us as Christians is I think that the institutions of the church are considered to be very intolerant today and seem to be not using their power to help raise up other people. And I think the response to that, which we'll probably get to again later, is that we really need to dive deeply into our ecclesiology or our theology of church, to really talk about how the local church is actually the place where we can actually express those really deep egalitarian themes that were present in the early church, where people were equal. I mean, unfortunately, when you go into some car parks today in churches, you can see a great deal of wealth on display in car parks. So I think people see that. And, we were talking before the podcast started, Joel, about someone who was saying that they were particularly upset at how the church doesn't pay tax in Australia. That doesn't seem very egalitarian. And you can see some examples where people can rightly say, well, why doesn't the church pay tax there? But then sometimes people don't understand that, for example, in a church organisation like the Anglican Church, we've got Anglicare, which is spending heaps and heaps of money on helping the poor. So there's this image problem that we talked about last season that's still present for us, that maybe we're seen a bit more like Amazon than we are seen like Taylor Swift.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, because we'll come back to how we actually engage in that. I think was where we like to talk about the shock absorber being really important. And I was just thinking, I was just sitting here listening to you guys going back and forth, which was really quite educational for me, so thank you. But I was just thinking that so Hussey pulls up those two poles of hierarchical and egalitarianism structures. I feel like perhaps Taylor is capturing the struggle that the culture is having between those two things. It's almost like we're being told to be really individualistic, but we also, that almost seems to clash a little bit with being egalitarian. Like you need to earn lots of money, but you also need to give it out. But Taylor seems to have actually done a really good job of actually pulling that off. And that's why she's so popular. And I was just thinking that song that she, one of her very popular songs is "Shake It Off," and I think that was another song that she wrote to. She likes to use the criticism that she experiences as an inspiration for her music. We talked about how she aligned herself with the hipster trend, and Instagram really pushed her forward. But then Instagram is, as again we said, that it's a personal PR tool. You talked about Miroslav Volf last week, that we have multiple identities, and we can use Instagram or other social media as a way of projecting the image or the identity that we want people to believe. But I think it also captures the thing of people are still unhappy, because there was a story of Chrissy Teigen who shared a really sad thing where she, her and her husband John Legend, who are very popular she's a model, he's an extremely huge artist, but we want our celebrities to have all this access and show us all the parts of their lives, because we find that we want to indulge in a life like that. But then she shared something about being, they were in hospital and sadly they lost a baby, and she showed herself crying and all that kind of stuff on Instagram, and then she experienced a whole lot of criticism for that as well, because we don't want to see that far into your life as well. So I feel like that's capturing what we're actually doing within this cultural moment, is be individualistic but also look after everyone. And I feel like how do we
And I think what's interesting about those two examples, particularly with Taylor Swift, when she pushes back at her critics, it's really easy for many people in the public to associate with her as a victim of hierarchical institutions who are uncaring and old ways of thinking that we're trying to change. So her political songs, her challenges to authority. We talked a bit about Apple, but also she has been quite a big voice in the Me Too movement that's emerged in the 2010s, and also the LGBTQ plus community, and arguing for rights in that community as well. So she is very successful and wealthy, which is seen as an admirable trait in our culture, but she's also using that wealth and power to speak for those who are considered to be suppressed by hierarchical institutions. It's interesting that we made the comment last week that in 1971 we saw some of the themes emerging right back in the late 60s, early 70s, that would end up setting down a lot of the themes for our culture right up until today. And through the music of David Bowie, which we looked at last week, we were introducing, I suppose, ourselves to some of the big themes of the 2010s through someone who passed away in the 2010s who was part of that original movement. So as I looked into that a little bit, there's a thinker that's really helpful for us to understand the new themes in our culture through the lens of what's called new social movements. So there's a thinker called Alan Turing who's looked at the 1960s. He actually looked at the Paris riots in 1964 and was asking the question what was going on there. And he saw that the influence of the Paris riots in 1964, where unionists and young people got together to challenge the authorities of the day, he looked at that and went, oh, something new's happening here. Young people and unionists are working together. And what he made as an analysis was that in the past, political power was defined by the owners of capital and the workers. So in Australia, you might have the Liberal Party and the Labor Party representing those two traditional power groupings within society. So there were the workers who were getting together in unions, and the Labor Party to call on their rights, and then the Liberal Party who broadly represented Protestants and people who were owners of capital and small business people, and you got the Catholics and the workers on the other side. That was a kind of really traditional power grouping in Australia up until the 1960s. But what Turing says happened in the 1960s is that ideas replaced economics as the definer of political distinctions. And so new social movements that emerged in the late 60s, like the civil rights movement with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and that movement, the anti-war movement, the environment movement, the gay rights movement, the feminist movement that emerged again in the 1960s and 70s, those movements began to reshape a more postmodern Western context where we questioned the hierarchical institutions of the past that were battling it out with each other, even if they were unions or they were people representing the owners of capital. They were still seen as institutions, and the church was seen as one of those older institutions as well. So a lot of people rejected the church in the 1970s, and we talked on earlier podcasts about the emergence of something called the Jesus movement in the early 1970s. 1971, there was a Time magazine article cover that was called the Jesus Revolution, where it described the fact that there were 800 Jesus communes that had popped up in America in just 1 year, where you could drive from New York all the way to LA without paying anything for board because you could stay at a hippie Jesus commune. Well, that was a new social movement too that came up and died off with the hippie movement. But what we've got is these shadows of these movements that have been cast all the way through to our era today. So what Taylor Swift does in her music is she's picking up on probably more than just two, but there's two that come to my mind, and one of them is the feminist movement with the new expression of that in the 2010s with the Me Too movement, and she's been a big part of that, which you guys might want to add some more detail to some of the story there, but also with her standing up for gay rights as well, and she's become part of that movement as well. So here we see the politicisation of ideas and people associating with certain ideas in an egalitarian way, standing up to the hierarchies and the institutions, is actually seen as quite a progressive and modern trend. You know, people talk about being on the right side or the wrong side of history. Well, she's probably seen as being, at the moment, she's seen as being on the right side of history, I suppose, from the point of view of this movement that started back in 1970s.
It's fascinating. I've seen an excerpt I didn't get to watch the whole documentary, but Miss Americana is a documentary about her, and she struggles with that, and she does say, I want to be on the right side of history.
Yeah.
And it's a battle, and she has a battle with her advisors and her team about, I want to speak up about these issues that are really important to me, and they're saying, no, don't do it, just focus on the music.
Yeah.
But then she has to deal with, I think I should be on the right side of history, so now I need to come out and talk about these issues that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think feminism was a really big one of that. I mean, I don't know if you guys have got any more detail on some of the things she's done in that space.
Taylor took a former DJ to court in a sexual assault trial, and in that trial she was only seeking $1 in damages, which they ruled in her favour. And then she, in contrast to only receiving $1 in damages, she also donated $250,000 to Kesha's trial, which is a similar kind of case against a producer. And that was at the very beginning of the Me Too movement, Tim. Yeah,
so this is a really significant cultural moment in the 2010s. The Me Too movement, it's got a sort of long build-up, and so there was some early use of the term Me Too in 2006 on MySpace. Tarana Burke is generally accredited with being the first one to use that phrase in this context about using sexual assault. But it really gained steam just after these cases in October 2017 is really where it starts to build momentum, and that's when allegations of sexual abuse from Harvey Weinstein come out. And so we get a lot of very high profile Hollywood celebrities particularly speaking about the sexual assault that's happening in their workplace and in the way that they might be groomed for particular roles, or the types of things that might happen as part of their producing of movies and in that industry. Like a lot of the social justice movements of the 2010s and even earlier, a lot of it is built on the idea that there is something happening quietly in the background of society that's not being talked about, and we're trying to bring that into the forefront. So that's the case with LGBTQ+. It's the feminist movements and the different ways of that have happened, the slavery, anti-slavery movements of past generations as well. This idea that there is something that's acceptable in society and sort of brushed under the carpet was actually disastrous and needs to be addressed. And so bringing it out to the light and making much of it. And so so from 2017 onwards, it becomes quite a big thing. Again, it becomes a hashtag, which again is a cultural idiom that transfers on social media platforms, Twitter particularly, in people being able to tell their story. And so the encouragement is that you tell your own story of sexual assault or abuse. You use the hashtag #MeToo. And what this does is it raises the temperature. It realises that this is not an irregular occurrence, but this is something that happens tragically to so many different people of all different fields. And so where Taylor Swift comes into this, as well as a number of those other Hollywood celebrities, is they're able to use their platform to raise the voices of those who are voiceless. So the people in our communities, the people who are just in the neighbourhoods and don't feel they have the voice to do anything about this, as they're able to share their stories in amongst the stories of those who are more well known in our society. It really shows the prevalence of this really tragic part of our society, that so much sexual assault is happening.
So what's really interesting about that too is Hussey's analysis would help us to see that that's part of this egalitarian impulse, and it's putting institutions right across the board in these hierarchical power structures under the microscope to call out their misuse of power when it's used. And one of the institutions that is being examined by this Me Too movement as well is the church. The church is also being examined for misuse of male power, and there are many voices raised in the media and even within the churches with this progressive impulse seeking to call out institutions for misuse of male power as well.
Because it was not long after the hashtag #MeToo was coming into cultural prominence, you also got the hashtag #ChurchToo, which helped share those stories, that there are these other institutions where abuse is happening, and so people are sharing their stories of abuse within the Christian church as well.
Yeah, and there's even been calls for the church to consider its power structures and its theology in this regard, and we belong, in those of us on this podcast, we belong to the Sydney Anglican Church, and our particular church is being examined for our theology of complementarianism. That might be another podcast we could do another time, but an egalitarian view of men and women's roles in the church is being contrasted to a complementarian view, which is considered to be more hierarchical. So in our particular church context, there's this movement is a big debate that's taking place as well in the church.
I was just going to say you've got the intersection of a number of themes which are really prominent in Taylor Swift's story. So there's the feminism and her strong pro-woman positioning. It's where, and that intersects with the abuse that's happening, which is the anti-authoritarian or anti-establishment, and the egalitarian as well. So in this particular Me Too movement, you've got a number of that all coalescing and coming together, and so she's able to speak so powerfully into that because of all of these strands that Hussey notices are all coming together. And it hasn't just been the Me Too movement that Taylor has been a voice in. It's also, she's a great advocate of the LGBTQ plus community, particularly her 2019 song "You Need to Calm Down" was a big voice against internet trolls, homophobia, the way in which LGBTQ plus people are treated in society, and she's trying to promote them and again give them voice. And so the video, particularly for that, had a number of icons from that community that were there, and she's promoting them, giving them the platform, sharing the space that she has with them in order to identify as a voice, as an advocate for them in their community.
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on in the culture, which I think Taylor really touches on a lot of the time. Stu, we talked about at the beginning of the podcast how the church responds to that. How does the church respond to that, and how can the shock absorber play a part in that?
Yeah, well, the church has had various different approaches. Some Christians have taken what some people call a progressive Christian line on this and aligned fairly strongly with some of these progressive issues. Some Christian churches have just critiqued and rejected that. I mean, in some Christian circles, there's pointers to the Southern Baptists in America and their support. Some of the Southern Baptists in America and their support of the Trump campaign, for example, is what was seen by some people as a pushback against some of those progressive ideas. And so, as Terrain said earlier, that ideas are becoming a political battleground, and so some of these political debates are coming into the church now, and Christians are taking sides, sometimes on one side or the other of that. What I find really helpful about Hussey's analysis is that rather than embracing or critiquing a particular cultural aspect of our society, he argues that the biblical writers embrace and critique aspects of culture. And so I think it's really important that we keep Jesus at the centre of our conversations, and rather than politicising our theology, we should actually be asking, what does the Bible teach us about these issues? And then how do we actually discuss that together in the church to have conversations around it? So we've talked often about bringing younger people and older people together in conversations in the church, and listening to the voices of younger people, but also providing older people who have been reading the Bible and living Christian lives for many years the opportunity to speak into context as well. So a lot of these progressive issues are issues that really concern young people, so giving young people an opportunity to talk about those things in the church, where they can actually also listen to the perspectives of a biblical context, is really important. I think it's important that we come together with the Bible as our authority, and we sit under the authority of God's Word. And just a couple of things we've done in our context in our church over the last 5 years or so with both these issues is the Me Too movement has in some aspects of the Me Too movement in the newspapers and stuff has pressed in against Sydney Anglican churches that have a complementarian theology where men preach and men lead churches, and so there's been a challenge to that. Theologically, our church has considered that, and we what would be described as a complementarian church. We have myself as the lead pastor at Soul Revival Church as a man, and we have men preach at Soul Revival Church. Although we have men and women on our leadership team, we have women who are teaching as well as men. Actually, our training pastor Karen is a really important part of our team. But in terms of giving young people an opportunity to ask us, why do we make these decisions, we decided we'd have a forum at one of our gatherings to give young people an opportunity to share their thoughts on these issues, talk about what they are thinking, and then to hear what is the biblical rationale for our position. So we talked about 1 Timothy 2, and in 1 Timothy 2, Paul's talking about men preaching, and so we had an opportunity to talk about, is that just a cultural declaration for his time, or is that something that still applies to our day too? So having that forum where we discussed that together was really good, because we got an opportunity to discuss the Bible together as young and old together. But in a similar way, when the same-sex marriage debate occurred in Australia, and it was very divisive in our community, we held a forum in our church, and we had someone from Moore College come and give a biblical perspective, and I gave a short introduction to the history of the gay rights movement from the 70s right up until the same-sex marriage debate, and in Australia. And we had this really great conversation. There was about 70 people in the room. And after we presented the initial presentations, there was a member of the LGBTQ plus community who said, I just want to thank you for the grace that you've shown to my community. And while you've presented a position I don't agree with, I really respect that you've been really gracious in the way you presented that. And I want to be really gracious as I push back against that. And I found that forum quite a moving experience as we were able to talk about it. We described a biblical view of marriage that the Sydney Anglican Church holds to, and we also talked about how there were different theologies that different churches have, but in our church we were going to hold to a biblical view of marriage. But then we also said if people disagree with that, they're still welcome to come to church, and we can be church together. So that was a really terrific example, I think, of this idea of the shock absorber, bringing young people and older people together to have a conversation. Those conversations aren't always easy and aren't always gracious, but it's really important that we have them, because I think we've lost the experience of having a group conversation in our culture. We're used to putting a post on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, sharing our view and then critiquing each other's views online. We're not used to face-to-face conversations, particularly in a big group of people, that can be really important. I mean, there are some examples of that, like Q&A on the ABC. I think that's a program that does that. But yeah, just bringing people together to talk with each other and just to listen as well. Ask what's your view and but I think it's really important in our day and age that we remember that the Bible is our authority, and that we keep trying to work out how do the Bible writers embrace or critique any particular aspect of the culture.
Anything you want to add to that, Tim?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the Bible passages I was thinking about as I listened and had a bit of a look into Taylor Swift was Philippians 2. In Philippians 2, we've got the hymn from verse 5 onwards, where it talks about having the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Being found in appearance of man, humbled himself, become obedient to death, even death on a cross. And the reason I thought of Taylor Swift, I thought of this verse when I was thinking about Taylor Swift, was this idea that Jesus did have ultimate power. He is the eternal Son of God. He's part of the triune Godhead. And yet, in using that power, he actually uses the power to serve others. And I think that is part of the impulse of what Taylor Swift, from what I can see as an outside observer, that seems to be her impulse, that she recognises that she does have power and influence. She's got financial backing. She's not lacking for any of those things. And so she's using those powers to serve others. So I think that would be one resonance that I would see in where I can see that the way that she's seeking to use power, that it's actually, I think she is, there's an aspect of common grace there that she's expressing. And maybe as we critique as well, the hymn goes on, that therefore God exalted him to the highest place, gave him the name that is above every name, that the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. When we accept that Jesus Christ is Lord, then there are going to be parts of our secular culture that we will push back against because we are taking our authority from the Bible. We're taking our leadership from Jesus Christ as Lord. And so there are going to be issues and questions on sexuality, on power, on abuse, on hierarchical structures, all of these kind of things. We're not going to be looking to the culture for our answers. We're actually going to be looking at the Bible and seeking how does that actually speak into us as a church community. And so that's part of that listening, that's part of that shock absorber, that we're allowing the culture and those who are at the forefront of cultural change to express to us what is going on and hearing from them. And then we're also using the strength of mature Christians and those who are deeply rooted in the Word of God and using those together. So I think that's the shock absorber in action. I think that hymn in Philippians 2 was what kind of came to mind, as I can kind of see things that are really admirable about what Taylor Swift is doing really well, particularly in her political and cultural and advocacy kind of role. But also we would say that there are things that we disagree with because Christ is our Lord. And so we're taking our orders from him.
I think that's really interesting too, because I was thinking of Mark chapter 1 where Jesus says, I've come to bring the kingdom of heaven, repent and believe. And so his command to us is to repent of our sin and to believe in him. So interestingly there is a hierarchy there, that he is a king, and so we do need to take his leadership.
Yes.
And Jesus himself says, I haven't come on my own account, but I come in the name of the Father. So there's even a hierarchy there when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane before he goes to the cross, and he prays before he goes to the cross, and he says, Father, not my will but yours. He's come to do the will of the Father. So there's that hierarchy there. I think it's interesting that as we as Christians look at scriptures, sometimes there'll be things that resonate with our culture and some things that don't. And it's really important that we don't pick and choose what we take from the Bible. As we read the Bible, we've got a really timeless word of God that speaks clearly into each generation, both embracing some aspects of each generation and critiquing each generation. So, but then again, another thing to think about is the church actually an institution, or is it something else? I mean, we could argue that at the end of Christendom, there is a good argument to really remember the place of the local church and how important the local church is as the gathering of God's people. We're reminded that when the church gathers together, when 2 or 3 gather together, he's there in the midst of us. And so I think that's a really important thing to consider too. So I think that in the context of these conversations we have, we need to always be asking the question, what does the Bible have to say about this, rather than just what's my opinion or what's your opinion.
I was thinking as well in Hussey's dynamic between hierarchical and egalitarian. Again, we see both in the pages of the New Testament, the letters that are written, that there is an egalitarianism there. There's no male or female, slave or free. And so there is a leveling there of relationships, that we are all the same. We're all just adopted by the same blood of Jesus. We're all equal to each other. And yet we have other parts of the same books which also say, God appoints pastors and teachers and people in place. Paul's writings to Timothy and to Titus about setting up structures in the church so there is appropriate leadership. And so, again, we don't want to hold on to one of those to the expense of the other, but to hold them in tension and to say that both of these realities are going to be there. And if we completely flatten out everything egalitarian, then you have no leadership. But if you have really strong hierarchies and the elders in the church don't realise that they have extraordinary power, or they abuse that power, they're not recognising the egalitarian nature. So it's always this coming back and forth of those two ideas.
It's interesting, isn't it? I also think the nature of Christian leadership is different as well. It's not about power and control. It's about servant-heartedness. Like you mentioned Philippians that we're meant to emulate the humility of Christ, and we're meant to be a servant. And so our leaders should be servants, not dominators. Yeah,
Peter talks about, we're the shepherds of flocks, and yet we serve the under-shepherd. And so there's that.
Well, we serve as under-shepherd, is that what you mean?
Sorry, we are under the shepherd of Jesus. Yeah. And so we're responsible to him, and we also serve as those who are leaders in the church.
Yeah, it's good.
I think it's the way you guys are talking about it, we talk about those two poles of hierarchical and egalitarianism, and then you talk about Jesus, and like Taylor Swift is kind of doing that in a cultural context, but if you talk about Jesus, like Jesus is straddling those two poles really well, because he is a king, as you said, and there is a hierarchical structure amongst his kingdom, but also dying on the cross is like a pretty outrageous, amazing act of egalitarianism.
Well, it's the greatest act of love ever. Yeah. I think it's interesting that Jesus lays down his life for us, and in Matthew 22:37-40, he says, love God and love others. And I think what he's saying there is, I will teach you how to love. And again, we keep coming back to it, but Romans 12 says, in view of God's mercy, in other words, in view of Christ's sacrifice for us, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. And then in Romans 12, he unpacks that by saying, and be a body, serve together, serve under Christ. In Romans, Paul talks about being like that all the way through, but in Ephesians he also says we're like being built together in a spiritual house with Christ as the cornerstone. And so Christ is our the head of the church, but he's also building us together, and we're partnering with him as he builds his kingdom. So I think that's a really cool framework for us to continue to hold on to in the changing culture that we're a part of.
And he was also the servant, so even in dying on the cross, it wasn't really, he wasn't bringing himself down to our level. He was actually going below that again. We see that with the washing of the feet, that he takes this subservient role to his disciples and by analogy to us, which again comes up in that Philippians 2. So even there, it's a servanthood and through the service of others, and again this hymn in Philippians 2 comes full circle where he's then exalted as well.
And one last thing I'd say on that too, it's not like we have to create a cool church in every generation. We don't have to create a cultural representation of the culture around us. So we're not looking at Taylor Swift and the culture around us to go, oh, that's what's happening in the culture, we need to adjust to that. We are literally taking Hussey's framework and saying, well, there'll be parts of that we might embrace as we move forward, but there'll be parts of it that we're going to be willing to critique. And it'd be really interesting to hear from the listeners and the viewers their take on some of the positions we've presented today, and continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, you can continue the conversation, guys, by jumping on the Discord link, which is will be in the show notes. You can also email me at joel@shockabsorber.com.au, and we're also you can check out our digital services, which are on the podcast, any podcast app you listen to, or YouTube, and also a Chip Lodge podcast where we talk about growing up as a Christian or experiencing our life experiences as a Christian. So you can check those out. I'd just like to say thank you very much for Tim and Stu for that very engaging and thoughtful discussion. So I appreciate that. And we'll, as always, finish up with a
one way.